So, a common question that we get from athletes who we're coaching, some coaches who we work with, my parents, when they ask me questions about exercise, which is interesting because often my parents don't want to listen to my advice or my input, but sometimes they do actually ask me about something with the intention of following through on my feedback, which is very exciting for me. But people often ask about injuries, pain in training. Hey, my elbow is kind of bothering me a little bit. Is that okay? My knee acts up a little bit after I squat. I'm not really sure what to do. Is it okay to only do bicep curls on one side, or am I going to get like a weird giant arm if I do that? All these kinds of questions just about little nagging training injuries, or in some cases, more serious things that are, like an actual problem. And initial disclaimer, caveat, right? We are idiot strength coaches, not physical therapists, not doctors, not physiatrists, right? So everything we say here should be taken with several grains of salt for each of us. But we do want to talk about the idea of dealing with pain in training, dealing with injuries, whether they're overuse injuries or more acute injuries, especially through the lens of working with competitive athletes or kind of like wannabe competitive athletes, right? Because I think there's a very different relationship that people have with pain in training if they say, hey, listen, my goal is to compete at a high level, to qualify for an event, to beat someone else in a sport, right? That those people have sort of signed up for a different relationship with pain in their training compared to someone who's just coming into a gym who's like, I haven't worked out in 8 years. I want to get in shape. My doctor says I need to go on blood pressure medication if I don't figure this out. So, all this discussion will be more through the lens of working with competitive athletes or kind of like aspiring competitive athletes, which I do think changes the dynamic there. So we're going to do a few episodes on this. We're going to try to talk through some important things to think about for athletes training. If they are experiencing discomfort, like how should you think about that? Is there stuff that you should be doing? Is there stuff that you shouldn't be doing? And also for coaches in terms of both programming for these athletes, giving them things to work on, right, that may actually help them either deal with pain or prevent pain or overuse injury in the future. And then also just communicating, because a lot of communication surrounding pain, injuries, et cetera, can actually make a really big difference in terms of how athletes respond to discomfort when they feel it, right? Just like with a lot of stuff, if a coach can properly set expectations, open up lines of communication, that's where a lot of the value in actually having a coaching relationship with someone comes from. So if we're working with competitive athletes, aspiring competitors, there's a lot of very common things that sort of tend to pop up, whether that's specific kinds of overuse injuries or specific kinds of questions. So Luke, what are some of those things that you see from athletes who you work with where they're like, hey coach, I'm putting my notes in True Coach. I have this thing that always kind of bothers me. What are they saying? What are they asking you?
Yeah, I think I've had, tends to be sort of overuse style injuries or being hurt in some way with knees, shoulders, elbows, wrists. Sometimes you're going to get, I've had individuals who have had back issues or hip issues. Generally speaking, those things can be a little bit more serious. And I would say that a lot of it sort of stems from this movement hurts X, or and there's always usually a way of going around it, and whether it be changing the movement, whether it would be doing it with less load, but generally speaking, the types of things that I commonly see when I'm looking at people's feedback is stuff like that. It's this was painful after a training session. It's not necessarily like on rep 5 I felt this pop or this something. Those things do occur. And usually in those scenarios, people stop. But generally speaking, this is also stuff that people might sort of feel towards the end of the week once they've sort of had a few, tough training sessions. And also, like, I also understand that people's interest and people's motivation to work through these things also sort of wavers as well, like as they feel it and as they don't feel it. And I think there's definitely a big, you could say like a prescriptive mindset, like, okay, well, I need to do this to fix this. But it's such a common thing that occurs within a sport like CrossFit, where the sort of the demand and the repetition on the body through certain movement patterns is pretty high. And you can sort of see this with similar sports. You could say like long distance running, people experiencing issues through that might not necessarily mean that they can't run, but it means that they have to work through something. Like before the call, we were sort of talking that, it's not necessarily sports with like impact sports, like you're, crashing whilst you go mountain biking, or you're getting injured whilst doing something, playing like American football or rugby or something like that, where it's like you actually have to stop and you go to the doctor, or you go to physical therapy, and they're like, okay, you need to rest for X weeks, and then you're going to go through this, and this. So a lot of these issues that you do tend to see are things that you can work around and work through, and that sometimes can make it a lot more difficult to be able to navigate, and it can sort of lead to confusion, because I think a lot of the time people sort of think that it's a little bit like those more serious injuries, where it's like, okay, and don't get me wrong, there is protocols that are out there, but I think people will just want very black and white information. Okay, I'm going to be resting for this long, or I'm going to be doing this rehab exercise for this many weeks for this amount of sets and reps, and then this thing's going to go away.
Yeah, Luke, I think that's a really good way of framing it. A lot of people are looking for an answer that maybe isn't fully black or white, but it's kind of like, oh, this hurts. Should I either rest it, or should I do this banded glute exercise, or should I just tough it out? Right. And the answer is often not really any of those, right? It's some combination of a bunch of different things. So yeah, I think that you're right that people are looking for either like, it hurts, don't do it, or no pain, no gain, like paint some slogan on your wall and like do some smelling salts and get after it. Or like this very specific rehab exercise is going to be the solution to your problem. And, if you look at the stuff that gets traction on Instagram, it's often stuff like that, where it's like, got knee pain? Like, here's 3 quick tips to fix it. And it's like, dude, that's fucking stupid. Like, it doesn't actually work that way. Right. But, that's why we have this podcast that doesn't get, well, I mean, we don't post it on Instagram, but if we did, it wouldn't get any traction. It's not 3 banded knee exercises to solve your knee pain. But I do think that what you're getting at there is the question a lot of people have, which is like, what should I do about this discomfort, right? And like you mentioned, there's a lot of stuff that tends to pop up for athletes training in CrossFit, right? It's that golfer's elbow. It's like, oh man, my elbow is really starting to bother me. It kind of flares up if I do too many pull-ups, or if I get in the front rack, it sort of hurts, right? It's like irritation, jumper's knee. My knee gets a little bit stiff. I kind of don't love it when I do box jumps or a lot of double unders. Once I get warmed up, it feels okay though. Maybe a similar type of vibe with some plantar fasciitis. And these kinds of things are very tricky because they're persistent. They stick around for a long time, and it's not always super clear how much does it hurt? How serious is it? Do you need to not do these movements? Is it beneficial to train them a little bit and kind of try to like work through the pain? And there aren't clear answers, which is why we're trying to hopefully lay out some useful stuff to think about. So let's maybe pick one of these kind of like overuse types of situations, since I think that's what a lot of people end up dealing with. Luke, I think you mentioned, did you have golfer's elbow?
Yeah, I had golfer's elbow.
Yeah.
And
totally. Me too. Right.
It happens again,
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I had, and just to clarify for folks who aren't familiar, golfer's elbow is like medial epicondylitis, right? So like the inside of your elbow. Yeah, if you're watching on YouTube, this guy right here, it hurts. It gets painful, right? And it tends to bother people with pulling. Like pull-ups tend to be a thing, especially the eccentric. And then also for some people, it actually bothers them way more in like a front rack position. They really, really feel it, like front racking a bar for a front squat or pressing, and the pulling doesn't bother them as much. But that's something that if you ring that bell enough, it can stick around for 18 months. And then even when it gets better, you can still kind of feel it sometimes, right? So that's a pretty common thing. So, I mean, I guess Luke or John, if you have an athlete who has this golfer's elbow, they're like, yeah, this is kind of bothering me. What do you tell them?
So, I mean, my normal, it kind of actually depends on the level of the athlete and the level of their training experience. So for some people who've been, training for 6 months, I might give them different advice to someone who's been training for several years. Or if someone who's just doing like 3 classes a week compared to someone who's doing double sessions 4 times a week. Because I think often people who have less training experience tend to get more panicked by small things. And And it could be something as simple as, yeah, you're just like a little bit tight through your triceps and forearm, and you just need to like do a little bit of mobility, loosen up a bit, and you'll be fine. I think also those people sometimes see muscle soreness from working out as the pain of an injury. And it could just be they did, 65 ring rows in a workout, which is twice the number they've ever done before, and actually it's just a little bit of muscle soreness from that. My recommendation for those people is always take a couple of days of rest without using it. See if that's made any difference. Because that kind of weeds out that muscle soreness versus injury. And, for a higher level performing athlete or someone who does a lot more training volume, that's going to look a little different. Because the chances are that it's something more serious, like an actual tennis elbow situation where it's something that we need to address in a more comprehensive manner, I would say.
I think what you were sort of saying there, when like people coming up to you, and whether it's if it's that person who comes to class a few times a week, or like sometimes there is a little bit like, okay, what do I do now? There's usually that's the thing that people want to know, and I think that sometimes like just absolutely resting it and taking the stress away, or what could be the input that's causing it, like. Generally speaking, that's the first thing you're gonna always want to do in most situations. But then, as well as that, is sort of like looking at, okay, well, one of the things I noticed with clients I work with for a while is that you sort of see these things and they may stem from another place, and there may be some link. You hear of Kelly Starrett definitely popularized the idea of like upstream downstream and things like that happening, and I wouldn't necessarily say that I have a deep enough knowledge in anatomy and injury and pain and those types of things to be like, okay, yeah, it stems from here. This you have like immobility in this part of your ribs and all this type of things, and we're gonna fix that. But it's you will start to sort of notice things, and people may have like one side of their body which sort of constantly just gets jacked up, and they may need to work on it. And I know that Todd, when you sort of introduced the idea of or sort of the more PRI concepts and that type of stuff, that sort of resonated with me. I was like, okay, sort of understanding all of this is sort of happening, or not necessarily all of this is happening, but like a lot of this type of stuff can sort of be happening in the same place and sort of causing issues. And then you've got to sort of try to figure out a plan, which is, generally speaking, figure out what the low hanging fruit is. Okay, what's the easiest thing that they can do now, maybe to sort of work on this? And, maybe it's like a breathing exercise, or it's just like implementing a bit more mobility, or hey, just like foam roll for 5 minutes before a session, or that type of thing to sort of work through these things. In no way am I saying that foam rolling is like getting body work done, but like it is not. You do it for 5 minutes before a training session, you sort of feel better. And there is a part of this where you do want to be taking care of people's immediate problems, and that you do want to be taking care of their long-term problems, but at the same time, getting them feeling good and going through stuff. There can be some positivity around that, and trying to get people to develop some good habits. And maybe this breathing exercise doesn't necessarily work on expanding the rib cage, or it doesn't necessarily get the thing that we want it to help with the shoulder or the elbow or whatever, but maybe getting you just to like sit down and breathe for 2 to 3 minutes before your session might be a good thing for you to do, because you're just high stress and you're at work, and then you go to training, and some of these things they might not actually be in the thing that you think they will do, but sometimes they can actually have a positive effect as well.
Yeah, I wanted to jump back to something that John was saying that I think is really relevant here, which is just the sort of like tacit knowledge of understanding what kind of discomfort is okay and what kind of discomfort isn't okay, right? John, like you mentioned, especially newer athletes don't have a solid framework for, does my wrist hurt because it's injured, or does my wrist hurt because I've never front squatted before and my wrist was just in a position under load that it has literally never been in, right? Does my elbow hurt because I'm about to rupture some sort of, flexor tendon in my forearm? Or does it hurt because I did too many ring rows the day before? And building up that tacit knowledge of like what's okay and what's not okay, I think is really, really important for people. And that the role of a coach is often to give people feedback of like, hey, listen, like on a scale of 1 to 10, how much does that actually hurt? Maybe it's like a 3. Okay, generally, if it's below a 4, it's not something that you need to be like super, super concerned with, but maybe something to keep an eye on. Does it feel sketchy at all? Or is it just like a little bit stiff? I think it's just a little bit stiff. Okay, awesome. Like that's totally fine. Stiffness is common. If it does feel sketchy, if it feels like something is going to dislocate, or it feels like something is going to like tear or whatever, like maybe that's something you need to stop immediately, because if it feels like it's going to dislocate, I think Kelly Starrett says this, like it's probably maybe about to dislocate. Like let's not do that, right? So just giving people that feedback of like, hey, you have an intuition about this that may not always be 100% correct, but if we can just sort of make you more aware of what you're feeling and give you a framework to think about like, this is discomfort rather than pain. This is soreness rather than pain. This is stiffness. This is like hypermobility. This feels like wrong and bad. That's, I think, something that's really, really useful for people. And to Luke's point, just about these kind of like chronic overuse injury situations as well, right? That's an area that I think a coach can be really, really helpful in terms of calibrating people's intuition about whether they should push through something or whether they need to rest it. Because like we were talking about with golfer's elbow in particular, right? That's an injury that once you actually kind of like give yourself a serious case of golfer's elbow, give yourself a serious case of plantar fasciitis, give yourself a serious case of jumper's knee, you might literally have discomfort in that area with certain movements for 12 to 18 months, right? Like, doesn't matter how much tissue work you do, doesn't matter if you get dry needling, doesn't matter if you do like the coolest PRI quadruped breathing exercise, you might have discomfort in that tissue with certain movements for over a year. And if you're training for something serious and you're trying to qualify, it's like, well, guess what isn't an option? Not doing butterfly pull-ups for 18 months. Right? So, okay, what are we going to do? Can we figure out a way to actually train through this that isn't going to cause you serious long-term damage? And that's something we're actually working with a physical therapist who works with athletes can be very helpful, because they can let you know like, hey, listen, like this type of tendinopathy, this type of pain with this movement, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're causing long-term degenerative tissue damage. It just means that you sensitize the periosteum where the tendon actually attaches to the bone to the point that it's going to piss you off forever. Everything looks okay. You can continue with activity provided you don't XYZ. And if you can get that kind of clearance, then that's a situation where as a coach, you can work with that athlete and help them understand like, this is going to hurt a little bit, but your goal is to be competitive and your goal is to win, which means occasionally pushing through pain. And we're going to try to do this in a safe way and in a way that doesn't exacerbate this, but that's something you kind of have to be okay with, right? Whereas in another situation, that they might get some imaging done, or, their therapist might be like, hey, listen, like if you keep doing this, you're going to need to get shoulder surgery at some point because you're going to potentially tear your rotator cuff or just kind of like rip your labrum to shreds. And if you want to keep snatching, like I'm not going to tell you no, but I don't like what I see here. And that's a different situation, right? And so there's not always a clear answer, but giving people a framework of what to think about and having them work with a practitioner who can hopefully give them some sort of like lane in which they can train in, I think is very, very valuable.
Yeah, like I think the sort of the way you're explaining it is almost okay with these sort of chronic issues is similar to say the more experienced athlete who generally just will always need to work on a certain area of their game because that's where they're weaker at. And it just might be one of those things where it's like, okay, we know about elite level CrossFitters who have just had chronic issues and they always have issues. I think Ben Smith sort of comes to mind. That's a guy who has performed at the highest level, and on numerous occasions, I recall him saying, "Yeah, I haven't squatted for X amount of time, or the only time I squatted was during these competitions and stuff like that." And I think that one of the things that was, I've had knee surgery and knee pain, in every single way whilst I was doing CrossFit. But one of the things that was, I would say, a belief I had was I needed to do back squats, I needed to do these movements, and I needed to do this to be good at the sport. And then I think I started working with a coach, and I realized I wasn't doing those things. And the only time that I was actually going through a squat pattern was either in a Metcon or maybe some light Olympic weightlifting on occasion. And I was still progressing overall in terms of numbers and stuff like that. And I think that that's one of the things that people can, if they understand that there might be certain things that they don't necessarily need to touch on as much, that aggravate their injuries, or maybe there's certain things that they don't actually need to train in that specific way, I think that that can be helpful, because it gives you a bit more leniency about how you go about a problem. And to be honest with you, that like if you do, say, different types of muscle endurance work for your legs, and lunging's okay, but squatting, if you do it too much, it sort of starts to annoy it. But you still sort of work on it in different ways. There might be like a very specific feeling that you get that you're not necessarily used to if you did a workout like Karen, but generally speaking, like you can sort of navigate those things a bit better, and you don't necessarily need to do the thing to keep progressing at the thing, especially if you are someone who is more of like an up and coming competitive athlete, and you have aspirational goals, or say for instance you're more of a hobbyist competitive athlete. I have clients who I have one client who has an issue with his shoulder, which he needs to get, I think, a part of his humerus sort of shaved down for it to sort of stop impinging. So we just don't necessarily go overhead as much as is sort of generally that generally happens within someone's training. So we just have to be a bit more careful with it. There's certain things that he's limited in how heavy you can go overhead. And he's aware of that, and every single time a clean and jerk comes up, he's like, oh crap. Every time a clean comes up, he's like, all right, okay, cool. So there's obviously that you have to manage potentially, but I think that just being able to understand that these types of things can be just sort of ongoing, and it's better to just sort of find a way and educate yourself in a way, and maybe view it a bit more like training as opposed to like what you would generally see within within sort of the world of injuries and having to do sort of rehab protocols and this type of thing. It could be just something that's there that sort of keeps going, just to be able to manage and allow you to play the sport.
One thing I do want to touch on, Todd, I'm not entirely sure you're pronouncing dislocate right. You kept saying dislocate as opposed to dislocate. I just don't want people listening to be confused and wonder what you're talking about. So.
Yeah, we got to get the accent on there. We'll when we type up the show notes, we'll hold down the I key on the Mac and get the right accent there.
Yeah, happy to do some voiceover work once we finish recording today. I actually did have a point to add to that.
You belong on the office, John.
I genuinely had a point to make and I've forgotten it. Carry on.
That's what you get. That's what you get for being too silly.
Yeah,
my friend. Well, I will say that Luke's point just about elite level athletes having these kinds of injuries is also something that I think we should explicitly state as well, is that people who are training to maximize their physical potential are going to get hurt much more often than people who are training recreationally, right? And that's something that can be a little bit tricky for people. But if you really think about it, right, because they're like elite athletes know what they're doing. They take all their supplements, they have their fucking Whoop band, and they go to sleep on time. They inject themselves with exogenous hormones to promote recovery. Their technique is often fantastic.
I thought it was a dodgy kebab.
Yeah. Right. But they get hurt all the time. And it's because they are doing as much training as they can possibly tolerate and recover from. So what we said this before on the Legion podcast, and we'll probably say it again as we continue to talk about injuries and chronic overuse situations and all that kind of stuff. But if we think about the idea of actually creating tissue damage, which isn't necessarily the same thing as creating something painful, which we'll talk about again later on another episode. But if you are stressing the tissue more than that tissue can tolerate, you are potentially going to damage it. right? So by doing more volume, by doing more intensity, by doing more repetitions, by doing more weight, you're increasing the stress on your tissue, potentially to the point that you're going to exceed that tissue's capacity to adapt to that stress. And training to be the best that you can possibly be, almost by necessity, forces you to kind of toe that line of like, how much stress can this tissue tolerate and how much stress can this tissue adapt to? And intelligent coaching and intelligent training does a good job of kind of like getting close to that line and pulling back. But you're going to occasionally cross it, right? And that's just kind of part of the game of like, yeah, you want to be the best you can be at this. Well, guess what? You have to play that game a little bit, and it may result in you getting something that's like, yeah, guess what? I hate doing pistols. I'm going to have my meniscus shaved down at some point. And you know, that may not be something that you want to do, but that is kind of like almost a necessary risk that you're taking by trying to push your physical potential.
So to summarize for what we kind of run through today, there is obviously that difference for different levels of athletes as to how pain can be viewed within training and how these longer term issues are going to affect them. And you know, the higher end athletes are going to be experiencing more issues like this due to the volume, due to the intensity, due to the loading that they're putting themselves under. But ultimately, we should be working to avoid pain in general populations. You know, training shouldn't cause pain. It shouldn't leave you restricted in life outside of the gym. And as we go through these next few podcasts on this series, we're gonna touch on what is an appropriate level of pain, how we can be avoiding it, what steps can be taken to treat pain when it comes up, and hopefully give you guys something useful to take away from that.